So remember in the first concepts lecture, we talked about how concepts facilitate their roles for categorization and for storing, organizing, and retrieving knowledge by using my semi-symmetrical cone of conceptualization. So we said that when we are active in the world, our senses are taking in this superabundance of information, so much information that we really can't process it all. So, for instance, when we went in the vision lectures, we talked about how it was that a huge percentage of our visual processing is delivered to that very small area on the fovea, on the retina rather, called the fovea, that very small area of the visual field, and that we couldn't, in fact, process the entire visual field for that information. It's just too resource intensive. There's too much there. So when we get an input from our sensory systems to manage that superabundance of information, we want to reduce that input down to a set of manageable things that are relevant to the tasks at hand. And so we engage in this process of categorization. All right? We pull out and look at one small part, say, of the visual field. That categorization then immediately gives us access to this store of short-term information, this set of relevant, reliable information that we've gleaned about objects of that kind in our experience. And as time goes by, we can still use that same categorization as a means of accessing information in a long-term memory that isn't offered up immediately as part of that bump we get when we categorize an object. So our trade-off here of shunning off a whole bunch of information, that's a good trade-off for us because that information is all recoverable. So when we look at an object in the visual world, there's all sorts of details that we can glean about that object as a particular kind of object, the shades of its coloring, its specific sorts of shapes, its specific position in three-dimensional space, and so on. Once we categorize it, we get rid of all that information and start to think of it in terms of a trans-contextual category that we think will be contextually useful for interacting with that object. But if we need that other information, the world is like a memory here. We can just go back and look at it and recover that particular complexity. And so it's a good trade-off for us. Once we get that trans-contextual category, we access these highly useful information that's proven to be reliable and relevant in our experiences in the past. And we get that information almost immediately. If we need to get other information, we can use that same trans-contextual category to probe our long-term memory and get at our greater depth of knowledge about those categories. So with that in mind, when we start to think about similarity versus theory-based approaches, we want to see how it is that they differ with respect to all sorts of different aspects of the theory and how it pertains to that central sort of function of concepts. So how are concepts represented in each theory? Well, similarity-based approaches suppose that concepts are similarities of structure, attribute lists that maybe have some correlations between them. So they're essentially a list of attributes and some correlations between those attributes, and that's what it is to represent that concept. The theory-based approach includes more information. We have these correlated attributes, but we also have all these principles that determine which correlations get noticed. And so we see this introduction of extra knowledge in the form of sort of basic rules about how this structure is supposed to be understood and used. And so these theory-based approaches are just more principled. They have more rule-like or classical conceptions of concepts. They have more principles like those. So if we want to see how that might play out, we could look at the concept of a bet. So we might think a prototype concept of a bet is going to include a whole bunch of features that will be useful and quickly identifying it as a bed. So it has 4 legs, a mattress, it's rectangular. The theory-based approach is going to have just more knowledge. It's going to have more structure to it. So when we think of the theory-based concept, it's going to say, look, beds have a function. The function is for sleeping on. They have 4 legs. Those legs have a function to support the mattress. They have a mattress. That mattress has a function. That's what we lie on when we sleep. They're rectangular in shape. There's more structure and more relationships between the structures. How do we get the category definition? That is, what counts and what doesn't count as an instance of that category. On our similarity-based approaches, we have various similarity matrices, and mostly it's summation of attributes. If you have enough attributes, then you are a member of that category. If you don't, you are not. Now, the theory-based approach includes explanatory principles that are common to category members. So, for example, right, artifacts like bottles. Part of what we have on the theory-based view when we have a concept of a bottle is the notion that it is an artifact, a thing that was created by human beings, and it has a function to hold liquids. And that is something that unites all those different pictures of bottles that we saw in the first concept lecture, even though they differ in color or shape and composition and so on. If we ask, well, what are the units of analysis? How does the categorization process work? What are we looking for? How do we analyze a visual scene to determine whether or not there's an instance of a category? Well, similarity-based approach, it's entirely based on attributes of those things. In the theory-based approach, there's attributes, but there are also explicitly represented relationships between attributes and between other concepts. So the concept is united together much more closely by a set of rules or principles about, for instance, its function, its causal role, and so on. When we look at the basis for categorization, in similarity-based approaches, it's attribute matching. That's how we categorize. In theory-based approaches, there's attribute matching, but there are also inferential processes that are supplied by underlying principles. So there are rules that are also used, inferences that are made based on principles about the sort of thing we're dealing with. When we think about how attributes get weighted in the similarity approach, the two sources are Q validity, how diagnostic is this of the kind of thing, and salience, how much does this jump to our attention. In our theory-based approach, weighting of attributes is determined in part by the importance of those attributes given the underlying principles that unify the concept as a whole. So we'll pick up this comparison in the next module.